Welcome to Chapter 3 as we begin our study in the Gospel of Matthew. We see there are several proposals for the structure of Matthew. The geographical movement begins after the prologue, goes into Galilee, up to the north, then back into Jerusalem for the Passion Week and the resurrection. A second view is to take it Christologically, using the catchphrase from that time on, the Christological development where you have the person of the Messiah, the proclamation of the Messiah, then, of course, the suffering, death, and resurrection of the Messiah. One of the most frequently proposed structures is the five discourse presentation. And we have this literary saying that says, and it happened when Jesus had finished saying these things. And then it moves into the next set of discourses. Now, though Carson will say that he thinks that's a little too much structure, that Matthew may not have really been that structured, there is a sense in which Matthew was aware of these discourses. So, Carson comes up with a 7-part outline. Let's take a look at that on the next slide. So here you see the 7-part outline, and you'll see that also is what he follows in the book. So you can read those sections in the textbook reading on this 7-part outline. There has been great debate over the anonymity of the Gospel of Matthew. In other words, that the gospel was circulated without the title according to Matthew, or the gospel according to Matthew, and it was assumed that these were added later, like as late as 120, 140, as you read in the textbook. But Hengel argues against this anonymous view, stating evidence that early on, if a writing was circulated, a writing like a gospel, it would need to have the attestation of the author on there. And he cites evidence, Hengel cites evidence, that Tertullian was in great criticism of Marcion because he circulated an anonymous gospel, because that was not the way you're supposed to do things, right? Well, regardless of this, there's a multiplicity of written gospels that show the author, and there's total unanimity of second century writers. So Carson and Moo, in short, there on page 142, they understood that Matthew was considered to be the author of the first gospel long before Papias wrote his words affirming the same. So they would hold that the according to Matthew would have been on there early. Now it was Papias who affirmed the connection of Matthew to this gospel. And there's quite some controversy in scholarship over the fragments of Papias's work because they only come through Eusebius. But we know that Irenaeus claims that, Irenaeus was written in the second half of the 2nd century. He insists that Papias and Polycarp knew the Apostle John personally. And the 4th century, Eusebius, claims that Papias did not know the Apostle John. However, this has all been parsed out and argued by scholarship, and it was well known that Eusebius did not like the millennial claims of Papias, and so he may have been trying to discredit Papias. At any rate, Carson comes down on the side of Irenaeus, Carson Moo, and they believe that it's far more likely that Irenaeus was correct in his assessment of Papias. And this being true, then we have evidence early on that Papias said that Matthew was connected early in the Christian history to his gospel. Now, Papias appears to make a claim that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic. This has been a very troubling and problematic statement. Now, there are three reasons to think otherwise, that perhaps there was not an Aramaic or Hebrew Matthew gospel written. First, the quotations from the Old Testament reflect multiple text forms. Okay, so in other words, you would think the quotations that we do have would reflect a Semitic text form of the Old Testament, but they are multiple forms. Second, if Matthew used Mark, then the verbal connections make it extremely unlikely that Matthew was written in a language other than Greek. Third, the Greek text of Matthew does not read as if it were a translation. Further complicating the topic surrounds the meaning of logia, that is, in Greek means sayings. Some say that the logia is Q. Remember, we talked about that in the synoptic chapter. Others say, no, logia doesn't mean Q. It's not talking about the sayings, but it's referring to the Old Testament. And thirdly, Kurzinger says, no, the logia refers to the canonical Matthew. And Papias's term, the Hebrew dialect, refers to the Semitic form or the literary style. So we see Carson and Moo reach the conclusion, that's sort of a hybrid here, that Papias was likely wrong to assert that Matthew was written in Hebrew or Aramaic, but that this does not mean he was wrong to assert that Matthew was the author of the gospel. We do see other internal factors. The other items we just discussed were external. Internal factors that relate the authorship of Matthew. It's the only gospel to refer to Matthew the tax collector, 10:3. Other gospels, Mark and Luke, use the name Levi when referring to the character of Matthew. 3. The assumption that Matthew was a tax collector. And lastly, Matthew's use of Mark. You have this commonality between those two Gospels. And we see, fifthly, that some would argue that it's too systematic versus a chronological account. And Carson Moo argue that you can give biography in a systematic or topical account. It doesn't have to always be chronological. Sixthly, they say that the Christology in Matthew is too highly developed. Well, Carson Moo offer up the Pauline corpus, Philippians chapter 2, 5-11. The Christus Psalm was developed very early. So proponents of against Matthean authorship would say it's too highly developed, therefore it's a later document that they're trying to read back into an early setting. But Christology was developed very early, as we see in other places in the New Testament. And 7, some scholars have argued against Matthew, saying he's really not a Jew. You have this anti-Judaism within the Gospel of Matthew. But as Carson and Moo show us, sometimes he doesn't distinguish between Pharisees and Sadducees, and yet at other times he does. So there are answers to every one of these critiques against the authorship of Matthew, and you can read all the details on those in your Carson Moo text. Now, exactly where was the gospel put together? Kirkpatrick has argued early on, through evidence he cites in the Church Fathers, that this was a community document that was written in Judea. Now, that would tend to make sense if you're going to follow the Church Fathers, because they also thought that this idea that the gospel was written in Aramaic was also a possibility, and naturally would want to put it in Judea if it's written in Aramaic. However, most scholars today opt for Syria, and they place it in Antioch. Other centers have been suggested, like Alexandria, Caesarea Maritima, Edessa, and Phoenicia. Each has a champion of that view, but the most plausible alternative to Syria would be the Transjordan. So there are a number of these, but in short, really can't be certain of the geographical location of where this gospel originated, but Syria holds the most votes as of today. Now, you have a number of opinions on the date of Matthew. There's a group that take the evidence together and say it had to be after 70 because of Mark's and Matthew's relationship. Because if Mark was written first in the anywhere from the late 50s to the mid 60s, then Matthew would have to be after 70. Later yet are some that would say it's written from 80 to 90. And it's pointed out, there are anachronistic references to the destruction of Jerusalem and the church. Also, the phrase "to this very day" is taken by this group to mean a very long interval. And then the tensions between Jews and Christians, the Berkath ha-Minim, is the curse on the Gentiles and the heretics in the Cairo Geniza. That was written later, and they claim that they see evidence of this in the gospel. But then the arguments for a pre-70 dating of this gospel also have their adherents. One of the arguments for the post-AD 70, they draw unnecessary conclusions from the evidence, according to the pre-70 group, that if the author was the apostle, then the earlier date is more plausible. Okay, second reason for going with an early date is that the church fathers were unanimous in ascribing it to an early date, and certain sayings that indicate the temple was still standing can be taken from these verses. If you read those, you could interpret a temple still around. So if we know the temple was destroyed in 70 and you have references to it there in the gospel, then it's pretty strong evidence for a pre-70 writing of the gospel. And further, there are few primary sources for the later date, so it's really hard to check them. And there seems to be no apparent Pauline influence in the gospel, which you would expect if Matthew and Paul had both been around in the churches. So we see that Carson and Moo put the date right at just before AD 70. Of the destination, it was written to Jews and to Gentiles. It is written for all Christians. We see in the purpose of Matthew to demonstrate Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of David, Son of God, Son of Man, Emmanuel, and he is the one who fulfills the Old Testament prophecy. Secondly, a purpose to demonstrate the rejection of Jesus. Thirdly, to inaugurate the kingdom. Fourth, to show a continued messianic reign. And 5, to show the foretaste of the future or the consummated kingdom. Contributions of Matthew. We have large blocks of Jesus' teaching. He complements the other Gospels. He uses the Old Testament. We see Matthew's treatment of the law, Matthew's insight into the church, and the unique elements of the portrayal of Jesus.